Hello, and welcome to the Authority Podcast, where we talk about the tea in the writing industry. I am E, your host, an author, editor, and book publisher of over 16 years. I have done everything. Are you ready to spill the tea? Hello, friends. This week we are talking about POV and Thee. Yes, it's a cheesy title, but I am so not sorry for that. I am in a number of writing groups, and one of the questions I see popping up all the time is whether or not people should write their story in first or third person. There are polls, arguments, anxiety, there's requests for critique. It's a pretty consistent worry for a lot of authors, honestly. But rather than telling you which POV to use, I'm actually going to get into what POV really is and how to use it effectively. It's one of those choices that many authors kind of make on an instinctual level, and they're usually right, but there's actually theory behind it, and there's right and wrong ways to use it. First, we're going to look at what's out there. There are a number of different POV styles that authors use. Some aren't used super often for reasons that will become obvious, but they do exist. So the usual types of POV are first-person single POV, which is the perspective of one character and I pronouns. First-person multi-POV, where you have multiple characters also using I pronouns, but you kind of switch between them. You have second-person, which is you pronouns, used for choose-your-own-adventure type stories, or sometimes literary stuff will use this. This is one of those ones that's really not common, though. Then there is third-person limited POV, which is really common. It's one character in third person, usually he, she, they pronouns. Then there's third-person limited multi-POV, where you have one character at a time in third person, and still the he, she, they pronouns, whichever. Then there's third-person omniscient, which is from the perspective of a narrator or somebody outside the story, and you know everything that's going on in everybody's head all the time, but you are close to absolutely nobody. There are probably other POV styles that exist that I did not include in this list, but I'm probably not familiar with them, so I didn't want to just add things at random. And like I said, second-person POV is really not used very often, but I did want to acknowledge that it exists and has been used before. One of the big things that I see most regularly is the idea of head-hopping versus omniscient POV. That's a really common gray area where people struggle a lot. Some genres really like head-hopping. Romance particularly tends to deploy it, but it really ruffles my feathers no matter what genre it's in because it's immersion-breaking and can be really confusing, and it's often done badly. There is, that said, a difference between that and omniscient POV, and that difference is really important. With an omniscient POV, the perspective of the storyteller is outside the characters. It's kind of like being told the story by somebody else around a campfire. So think of A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket, where the narrator tells the reader about things but is kind of their own character. Or, like Lord of the Rings used omniscient POV, the narrator isn't a character in that series, but it is still omniscient where you're kind of with everybody all the time, and you can kind of see all the pieces on the board. Omniscient POV is like the metaphorical camera lens we are watching this series through is positioned above the battlefield or above the story. You can see everything happening and get an understanding of things that individual characters don't know and can't know, like an orc hiding around a corner. You can know what everybody is thinking, too, but you're nowhere near as intimate with any of the characters because you're not in there with them really deeply. If a character's thoughts are shared, they're usually not given in like first-person dialogue-style narration. So here's an example of an omniscient perspective on a scene, and let me tell you, this is not literary genius, so just be patient. Glorith and her army fought through the orcish horde, blades flashing and glinting in the sunlight. All of them were too deep in the battle to notice the enemy forces amassing on a nearby hillock. The enemy commander, too, knew the distraction had worked. He smiled a horrible smile as he prepared to tell his men to engage. Now, in that example, you can see that we're kind of with Glorith and her people at the beginning, but also seeing what the enemy commander is doing and what he knows, and things that Glorith and her people don't know. It's both. You're not really intimate with either set of characters. You can kind of tell what they're feeling and guess what's going on, and you can know the enemy commander is really happy about this, but you're not in anybody's personal perspective. By contrast, here's an example of head-hopping. Glorith panted, the sweat on her brow running into her eyes as she swung at the enemy soldiers. The attack had been sudden, and she hadn't seen the enemy patrol until they'd blundered straight into them onto the road. I have to get back to the castle, she reminded herself. Whatever happens, I have to get back. The enemy commander up on the hill grinned as he watched Glorith fight. She would never make it back to that castle. He'd make sure of it. He nodded to his soldiers and gestured to the fighting elves. The master will be pleased with me, he thought. They are all going to die. In that second example, you can see that you're far closer to the characters and in their heads, right with them in those paragraphs. You're hearing their thoughts in first person. And then you're yanked out of her head and plopped in the orchestra commander's head where you're hearing his thoughts. There are plenty of times in books when you won't even get a paragraph break between the head hopping. It'll just kind of slip in and out in the individual paragraph without so much as changing. But you can see that you're in both characters' heads at the same time, and it's kind of bouncing back and forth between them without a scene or a chapter break. I've also seen people write from the perspective of more than two characters at once in the same scene, head hopping between all of them, and it just becomes a mess. As I mentioned earlier, some genres do head hop, like I mentioned romance, for example, but I really advise against doing it if you can get away with that. Like, please don't do it. If you're intimately in one character's perspective, being yanked out of it like that is not a pleasant experience. There are also plenty of times where I've struggled to know whose perspective I'm even in when an author is head hopping all the time, and I just don't know where I am, who I'm with, and what's going on. Head hopping is, to note specifically, it's when you change POV midstream. If you're writing multi-POV, you have paragraph or chapter breaks between the different perspectives. This gives the readers a chance to know that the change in POV is coming. If you change perspective characters between scenes or between chapters, that makes it obvious, and that is not head hopping. That is just multi-POV. Another question I hear a lot is, should I have multiple POVs? And this kind of depends on your story, if I'm honest. If you're going to do a multi-POV, you have to understand a few things, though. First, you need to be able to differentiate between individual character voices. This is particularly true if you're doing it in first person. My urban fantasy novels are all written in first person, and my POV characters have very different voices in their heads. Like, you can tell when Snow is talking and when Cass is talking. As such, if I was writing from multiple perspectives in the same book, I would need to make sure that those characters didn't bleed into one another, and Cassiel's voice stayed Cassiel's voice, and Snow's voice stayed Snow's voice. It's really important. It's a lot easier to do in third person, because third person isn't quite as intimate or as much in the character's unique voice, but it's still important not to bleed them together. You have to create distinct feelings for each of the characters, and that is an important thing to do. Next, you need to understand why you are doing more than one POV. Is this because the story is being told from different characters in multiple locations? Are you giving insight into the same story from multiple perspectives, kind of like a romance? Like, why are you wanting to write multiple POVs? What's the purpose behind it? And in order to make that assessment, you're going to need to spend some time thinking about it. Like, really dig down into why you want to do this. And the reason I want you to really think about this is because writing from multiple POVs is a lot more complicated than single POV. Sometimes I've seen authors forget that a character doesn't know a thing that another character does in a different POV, and keeping track of those internal thoughts and experiences can be really complicated, particularly for beginning writers. I'm not saying not to do it, but definitely don't do it without thought. If you are interested in really me digging into multi-POV and everything to do with that, I can do that in another episode. Let me know in the comments or something down below that that's something you want to do. Multi-POV books do have pretty specific guidelines on what works and what doesn't, and there are a lot of pitfalls authors tend to tumble into, particularly, like I said, doing them early on in your writing career. So that brings us down to the question, right? Which POV style should you use? And honestly, that just depends on the story you want to tell. There's no wrong answer here, and what POV style you choose is just going to kind of boil down to personal taste in the end of it. There aren't actual rules around what POV style you have to choose in which style of writing. I honestly recommend just thinking about what makes sense for you and your story. For example, using myself, my urban fantasy series I mentioned earlier is all written in first person, but a secret project I'm working on is in third person limited. I also have a high fantasy series I'm working on and have been forever that is third person limited too. Some stories just kind of lend themselves more to certain POV styles, and some characters really want to have a voice. So the only wrong answer here is going to be the one that doesn't work for you, just kind of like everything else I give you advice on. Like, the only wrong answer is what doesn't make sense. Another question I hear a lot is, can I mix POV styles? And the answer to that is, heck yes, you can. I have a high fantasy series I read at one point that had journal-style entries written in first person from the perspective of the villain, showing him spiraling into madness without revealing his identity. And the main body of the story was written in third person limited. Mixing POV styles is something you can absolutely do. You just have to do it on purpose and think about it and use it effectively. The thing about POV styles is that they're kind of forgiving a lot of the time. You just have to make sure that the reader knows what is coming and is on board. If you're writing third person limited for the entire book series and then switch to third person omniscient halfway through a chapter and then back again, your reader is going to be not happy with the results of that. Remember, your job as an author is to make sure your reader can follow the flow of what you're doing in the story. Like, that's the job. If they can't follow what we're doing in the flow of our story, we're obviously not doing it right. And just like with everything else here, when in doubt, if you're going to mess with your POV style and switch them, do it after a scene or a chapter break, and do it on purpose and intentionally with a plan. So there aren't any rules, right? Like, there are no rules here? Well, yeah, kinda. Just like most other things when it comes to your book, the rules for POV are kind of surrounding what makes a reader able to follow and enjoy the story. If you're going to confuse and dismay your readers, then you probably shouldn't do it that way. If the reader is getting literary whiplash, don't do it that way. Some of this is going to be a matter of taste. You have to understand not everyone is going to like everything you do, and people have opinions about POV. Some people will not read first person, some people will not read third. It's all about like personal taste in certain ways. But if your beta readers universally come back confused and not sure what's going on, you need to fix it. The only real rule I have as a general guide is I don't really like head hopping, as I'm sure you've probably gotten from my diatribe here. I don't think it ends well. I find it confusing. Certain genres are more permissive to it. You know, romance, erotica, sometimes they have no problems with that little bleed through. But just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. It's a pretty common thing back in the day for certain kinds of writing, like third-person omniscient mixed with third-person limited was a really common thing back in the back days. But modern audiences don't really like that as much. So you want to make sure that you think about these things. And if you do want to go with one of those choices and do it because it makes sense for you, like mixing POV styles or head hopping and whatever, if you're doing it, do it on purpose and know that it's going to limit the audience your book appeals to. Artistic choice is artistic choice, and I support that, but you have to make sure you're doing this on purpose with a full understanding of what it's going to mean for you. That is it for this week. I am looking forward to Author Nation coming up in November. If you are in the Las Vegas area and would like to meet me and about a million other people at a really epic book signing, check out Author Nation's Rave. It is going to be amazing. Also, Kevin Smith is going to be there, so, yes please? If you are going, you can pre-order your books, and that makes sure that your book is at my table for me to sign for you when you get there. So if you're going to be meeting me there, I only have a limited number of books, and it's best to pre-order so that you make sure that you get your copy. I'm also going to have some fun little trinkets and stickers and surprises for anybody who visits me at the booth, and I will absolutely give out hugs, unless I'm sick, in which case it'll be distance air hugs and a salute. Beyond that, if you are struggling with POV and not sure what to do and this podcast episode did not give you enough information, you can leave me a message in the comments, reach out to me. I do book coaching and I'm a professional editor. I might be able to help you figure out what your particular book needs. You can find me on my website, which is selfpub.me, so selfpub.me, and I will gladly make some time for you. We can do some coaching. I can help you figure this stuff out. Give me a call. If this isn't making any sense to you, you don't need to just struggle on your own forever. All right, friends, I will see you next week. Take care, be safe, and if you aren't going to be good, don't get caught.